It started with a simple patch of green, just a few tomato plants and a row of sunflowers in my front yard. But within days, I found a bright red notice taped to my door, demanding I rip out every last stem or face a $2,000 fine. I thought it was a mistake, maybe a misunderstanding. But then the HOA president showed up, clipboard in hand, and the threats got louder. Neighbors whispered, friendships shifted, and suddenly my peaceful street felt like enemy territory. Why would a garden spark so much outrage? And what would happen when I refused to back down? Before the trouble started, my life in Willow Creek was almost picture perfect. I'd moved here with my husband and our 2 kids, drawn by the promise of quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the kind of community where people waved from their porches and kids rode bikes until sunset. Our house wasn't the biggest on the block, but it was ours, a cozy, sunlit place with a patch of grass out front and a backyard just big enough for weekend barbecues and birthday parties. Every morning, I'd watch the sun rise over the rooftops as I sipped my coffee, listening to the distant hum of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The air always smelled faintly of cut grass and blooming jasmine. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left handwritten notes if you forgot to bring in your trash bins and where block parties were a regular thing. I'd always felt safe here, like I belonged. But beneath the surface, there were rules, lots of them. The HOA sent out newsletters every month, filled with reminders about lawn heights, mailbox colors, and the approved types of holiday decorations. Most of the time, I barely glanced at them. I figured as long as I kept my yard tidy and waved at the right people, I'd be left alone. Still, there were whispers. Stories about the HOA president, Mrs. Callahan, who seemed to have a sixth sense for spotting violations. Some neighbors joked that she measured grass with a ruler. Others said she once fined a family for having the wrong shade of mulch. I always laughed it off, thinking those stories were exaggerated. After all, I'd never had a problem. That spring, though, something changed. Maybe it was the endless gray of winter finally giving way to sunlight, or maybe I just wanted to teach my kids where food really comes from. Whatever the reason, I decided to plant a small garden in our front yard. Just a few tomatoes, some basil, and a row of sunflowers to brighten things up. My kids helped me dig the soil and drop in the seeds, their hands muddy and faces beaming with pride. It felt like a fresh start, a way to make our home truly ours. Neighbors stopped to admire the little sprouts, and for a while it seemed like everyone was cheering us on. But then, one morning, I noticed Mrs. Callahan walking slowly past our house, her eyes fixed on the garden. She didn't wave. She didn't smile, she just stared, lips pressed tight, before scribbling something in her notebook and moving on. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things, but a strange tension settled over me, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong, and as the days passed, that feeling only grew stronger. The first sign that things were about to spiral came just 3 days after Mrs. Callahan's silent inspection. I found a crisp, official-looking envelope wedged into my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's logo. My heart sank before I even opened it. Inside was a notice of violation, written in stiff, legal language. It claimed my garden was non-compliant with community landscaping standards and demanded its immediate removal. If I failed to comply within 7 days, the letter warned, I'd face a $2,000 fine. I stood in my kitchen, the letter trembling in my hands, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. My garden was hardly an eyesore, just a neat row of vegetables and a few cheerful sunflowers. I'd seen plenty of yards in the neighborhood that looked far less tidy. Why was I being singled out? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a misunderstanding, something that could be cleared up with a quick conversation. That afternoon, I called the HOA office. The woman who answered sounded bored, as if she'd heard it all before. She told me the rules were clear, only approved ornamental plants were allowed in front yards. No vegetables, no agricultural activity. I asked if there was any way to appeal, but she just repeated the rule, her voice flat and final. When I pressed further, she said, if you have a problem, take it up with the board at the next meeting. Then she hung up. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I'd never been to an HOA meeting before, but I circled the date on my calendar and spent the next week gathering support. I talked to neighbors, showed them the letter, and asked if they'd ever heard of such a rule. Most shook their heads, some looked away, and a few whispered that they'd had their own run-ins with Mrs. Callahan and the board. One neighbor, an older man named Mr. Harris, confided that he'd been fined for having a bird feeder that attracted wildlife. Another told me she'd been cited for a wind chime that was too loud. The more I heard, the more I realized this wasn't just about my garden. It was about control. The night of the meeting, I walked into the community center with my heart pounding. The room was filled with folding chairs and the low hum of nervous conversation. At the front sat the board, Mrs. Callahan in her signature red blazer, flanked by two men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. When my turn came to speak, I stood up and tried to keep my voice steady. I explained why I'd planted the garden, how it brought my family together, how it brightened the block. I asked why vegetables were banned when other plants were allowed. Mrs. Callahan didn't even look up from her notes. She simply read the rule aloud, word for word, and said, "The standards are in place to maintain property values and community aesthetics. Exceptions cannot be made." I tried to argue, but she cut me off, reminding me that failure to comply would result in escalating fines and possible legal action. The other board members nodded along, silent and expressionless. I left the meeting feeling defeated, but not broken. That night, I posted about my experience in the neighborhood Facebook group. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Some people offered support, sharing their own stories of petty fines and power trips. Others warned me to be careful, saying the board had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who pushed back. A few even suggested I contact the local news. The next morning, I woke up to find another notice taped to my door. This one was even more aggressive, threatening daily fines if the garden wasn't removed by the end of the week. I felt a surge of panic. $2,000 was more than we could afford, and the thought of daily penalties was terrifying. But every time I looked at the garden, at the tiny green shoots my kids had planted with their own hands, I knew I couldn't just give in. That day, Mrs. Callahan showed up in person. She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching as my children watered the plants. She didn't say a word to me, but I could feel her eyes burning holes in my back. Later, I heard from a neighbor that she'd been going door to door, warning people not to get involved, or they might find themselves on the wrong side of the rules. The message was clear. This was a battle, and I was on my own, but I wasn't ready to back down. I started researching the HOA's bylaws, digging through pages of legal jargon late into the night. I found vague language about community standards and aesthetic harmony, but nothing that specifically banned vegetable gardens. I printed out everything I could find and started building my case. Meanwhile, the pressure kept mounting. I received another letter, this one threatening to place a lien on our home if the fines weren't paid. My husband started to worry, asking if it was worth the risk. My kids asked why Mrs. Callahan didn't like our garden. I tried to reassure them, but inside, I was scared. The HOA seemed to have all the power, and I was just one person. Then things got worse. Someone started leaving anonymous notes in our mailbox, nasty handwritten messages telling us to follow the rules and stop ruining the neighborhood. One morning, I found that someone had trampled the sunflowers, snapping their stems and scattering petals across the lawn. My kids were heartbroken. I felt a mix of rage and helplessness, but I refused to let them see me cry. I decided to fight back, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. I reached out to a local gardening club, hoping they might have advice or resources. To my surprise, they offered to help organize a garden walk, inviting people from all over town to come see our little patch of green. The event was a huge success. Dozens of people showed up, admiring the plants and sharing stories of their own battles with overzealous HOAs. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful, but the board wasn't done with me yet. Day after the garden walk, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, threatening legal action if the garden wasn't removed immediately. The letter was full of intimidating language about breach of contract and damages to community property values. My hands shook as I read it. The stakes were getting higher, and I knew I needed help. That night, I called a local reporter who'd covered HOA disputes before. She listened to my story and agreed to come by the next day. When her article ran online, it quickly gained traction. People from all over the city started reaching out, offering support and sharing their own horror stories. The pressure on the HOA began to mount, but so did the backlash. Mrs. Callahan called an emergency board meeting, accusing me of inciting unrest and threatening to suspend my voting rights as a homeowner. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Some neighbors avoided me, afraid of getting caught in the crossfire. Others quietly slipped notes of encouragement into my mailbox or left small gifts on my porch. My family felt the strain, My husband and I argued more than usual, and my kids became anxious, asking if we'd have to move. I tried to stay strong for them, but the constant stress was wearing me down. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I received a summons to appear at a formal hearing before the board. The letter said I'd have a chance to present my case, but it felt more like a threat than an opportunity. I spent days preparing, gathering evidence, printing out supportive messages from neighbors, and rehearsing what I would say. The night of the hearing felt like the longest of my life. I barely slept, replaying every possible outcome in my mind, my nerves frayed and raw. By the time I arrived at the community center, the parking lot was already full. Word had spread far beyond our little street. Neighbors, reporters, even a few city officials had shown up, drawn by the promise of a showdown that had become the talk of Willow Creek. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The folding chairs were packed, people standing along the walls, whispering and glancing at me as I walked in. I could feel the weight of their eyes, some sympathetic, others wary, a few openly hostile. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat behind a long table, their faces set in stone. Mrs. Callahan, in her ever-present red blazer, looked up as I entered, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the tension was electric. When my case was called, I stood and walked to the front, my hands trembling just enough to make my papers rustle. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and began to speak. I told them about my garden, how it started as a family project, how it brought joy to my children, how it had become a small oasis in our neighborhood. I described the letters, the fines, the threats, the anonymous notes, and the vandalism. I spoke about the fear and anxiety that had crept into our home, the way my children asked if we'd have to move, the way my husband and I argued late into the night, wondering if we could afford to stay. I could see some faces in the crowd soften, others harden. Mrs. Callahan's expression never changed. When I finished, she launched into her rebuttal, reading from the bylaws, emphasizing the need for uniformity and property values. She accused me of stirring up trouble, of refusing to follow the rules everyone else accepted. Her voice was cold, clipped, and unwavering. Then something unexpected happened. A hand shot up in the crowd. It was Mr. Harris, the elderly neighbor who'd once been fined for his bird feeder. He stood, his voice shaking but clear, and said, "I think we've all had enough of these rules. This isn't about property values, it's about control." A murmur rippled through the room. Another neighbor stood, then another, each sharing their own stories. Fines for wind chimes, for holiday lights, for a child's basketball hoop left out overnight. The board tried to regain control, but the room had shifted. People were angry, fed up, emboldened by the chance to finally speak out. Mrs. Callahan's face grew redder with each new story, her composure slipping as she tried to gavel the room back to order. But the tide had turned. Just as the chaos reached its peak, the doors at the back of the room swung open. In walked the mayor, flanked by a local news crew. The room fell silent. The mayor, a tall woman with a calm, commanding presence, walked to the front and addressed the board. "I've been following this situation closely," she said, her voice carrying easily over the crowd. "And I have to say I'm concerned by what I've heard. Willow Creek is supposed to be a community, not a battleground. We should be encouraging families to grow gardens, not punishing them." Mrs. Callahan tried to interrupt, but the mayor held up a hand. "I've reviewed your bylaws. There's nothing in them that specifically bans vegetable gardens. In fact, the city encourages sustainable landscaping. I'm here tonight to ask the board to reconsider this fine and to remind you that your authority is not absolute." The room erupted in applause. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in Mrs. Callahan's eyes. She tried to argue, insisting that the board had the right to enforce its rules, but the mayor was unmoved. The news cameras captured every word, every expression, every moment of the confrontation. The board called a recess, retreating to a back room while the crowd buzzed with excitement. I stood in the center of it all, my heart pounding, barely able to believe what was happening. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before came up to shake my hand, to thank me for standing up, to apologize for not speaking out sooner. When the board finally returned, Mrs. Callahan's face was pale, her hands shaking as she read the decision. The fine was rescinded. The garden could stay. The board would review its landscaping policies in light of the community's feedback. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a terse statement and a quick adjournment. But the real climax came after the meeting in the parking lot. Mrs. Callahan approached me, her mask of authority finally slipping. She looked tired, defeated, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "You've made a lot of trouble for yourself. Don't think this is over." I stared at her, feeling a surge of anger and relief and exhaustion all at once. "Maybe it's just beginning," I replied, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. As I turned to leave, the news crew caught up with me, asking for a statement. I looked into the camera, thinking of my children, my neighbors, everyone who'd ever been bullied or silenced by people in power. "This isn't just about a garden," I said. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. If we don't speak up, nothing ever changes." The story aired that night, and by morning, my inbox was flooded with messages from people all over the city, some offering support, others sharing their own battles with HOAs. The mayor's office announced plans to review citywide HOA practices, and the local paper ran an editorial calling for reform. But even as the dust began to settle, I knew the fight wasn't truly over. Mrs. Callahan and the board still held power, and there were whispers of new rules, new ways to enforce their vision of order. The neighborhood was divided, some grateful for the change, others resentful of the attention and disruption. Still, something fundamental had shifted. People were talking, questioning, refusing to accept the status quo. The garden, once a symbol of defiance, had become a rallying point, a reminder that even the smallest act of resistance could spark something bigger. As I stood in my yard that evening, watching my children water the plants, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The sunflowers were blooming again, their bright faces turned toward the sky. The battle had been brutal, but for the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the shadows lengthened across the lawn, I couldn't help but wonder, what price would we pay for standing up, and how far would those in power go to keep control? The answer, I knew, was still unfolding, one garden, one voice, one act of courage at a time. In the days that followed the hearing, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter, conversations more open, and for the first time in a long while, people seemed willing to look each other in the eye. The story of the garden had spread far beyond Willow Creek, and the ripple effects were impossible to ignore. My inbox overflowed with messages, some from neighbors I'd never met, others from people across the city, even a few from out of state. They shared their own stories of HOA battles, of standing up to unfair rules, of small victories and bitter defeats. Many simply wrote to say thank you, to tell me that my fight had given them hope. The garden itself became a symbol. People stopped by to see it, to take photos, to ask about the best way to grow tomatoes or sunflowers. My children, once anxious and withdrawn, now greeted visitors with pride, eager to show off the plants they'd helped nurture. The garden walk became a monthly event, drawing families from all over town. What had started as a simple patch of green had grown into something much bigger, a gathering place, a conversation starter, a quiet act of rebellion that brought people together. But not everyone was happy. The board, strung by the public backlash and the mayor's intervention, retreated into damage control. Mrs. Callahan, once the unchallenged authority of Willow Creek, found her power slipping. She called for emergency meetings, tried to push through new rules, and sent out sternly worded emails warning of outside influences and the need for order. But the community had changed. People who once stayed silent now spoke up, questioning decisions, demanding transparency, and refusing to be intimidated. At the next board election, a record number of residents turned out to vote. For the first time in years, new faces joined the board, people who believed in fairness, who wanted to listen, who understood that a community was more than just a set of rules. Mrs. Callahan lost her seat by a wide margin. She left the meeting that night without a word, her red blazer a stark contrast against the gray evening sky. With new leadership, the board began to review the bylaws. They invited residents to participate, to share their ideas and concerns. The process wasn't easy, old habits die hard, and there were plenty of heated debates. But slowly, the rules began to change. The ban on vegetable gardens was lifted, replaced by guidelines that encouraged sustainable landscaping and community projects. Fines became a last resort, not a first response. The board even started a Good Neighbor program, recognizing residents who went out of their way to help others. The changes didn't happen overnight, and not everyone agreed with every decision. There were still arguments, still moments of tension, but the fear was gone. People felt empowered, invested in the place they called home. The garden, once a battleground, became a symbol of what was possible when people stood together. For my family, life slowly returned to normal. The anxiety that had haunted our home faded, replaced by a quiet sense of pride. My husband and I found ourselves talking late into the night again, but now the conversations were hopeful, filled with plans for the future. My children, once afraid to play outside, now spent hours in the yard, their laughter a reminder of what we'd fought for. Looking back, it was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. The battle with the HOA had been exhausting, frightening, and at times overwhelming. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. But every time I looked at my children, at the garden we'd built together, I knew I couldn't back down. I'd learned that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can spark the biggest changes. The impact of our fight reached far beyond Willow Creek. The mayor's office launched a citywide review of HOA practices, encouraging other neighborhoods to revisit their rules and prioritize community over control. Local news outlets ran follow-up stories, highlighting other residents who'd stood up to unfair treatment. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a city council meeting, sharing our story and urging leaders to protect homeowners' rights. I met people from all walks of life, retirees who'd been fined for garden gnomes, young families threatened over chalk drawings on sidewalks, veterans told to remove flags from their porches. Each story was different, but the theme was the same: the need for compassion, for common sense, for communities that valued people over perfection. The garden continued to thrive, a living testament to what we'd accomplished. Every season brought new growth: fresh tomatoes, bright sunflowers, fragrant basil. My children learned the rhythms of planting and harvest, the patience required to nurture something from seed to bloom. Neighbors shared cuttings and seeds, swapping stories and advice over the fence. The garden became a place of learning, of laughter, of connection. But the most important change was harder to see. It was in the way people treated each other, the willingness to listen, to compromise, to see beyond the surface. The fear that once kept us apart had been replaced by a sense of belonging, of shared purpose. We were no longer just residents of Willow Creek, we were a community. Of course, there were still challenges. Not every problem could be solved with a garden or a meeting. There were disagreements, setbacks, moments when old habits threatened to return. But now, when issues arose, people came together to talk, to find solutions, to remember what we'd learned. The scars of the battle remained, but they were a reminder of how far we'd come. Sometimes, late at night, I'd walk out to the garden and sit among the plants, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. I'd think about the journey we'd taken, the risks we'd faced, the courage it took to stand up when it would have been easier to stay silent. I'd remember the fear, the anger, the exhaustion, and the overwhelming relief when it was finally over. But most of all, I'd remember the moment when everything changed. The moment when one voice became many, when a simple garden became a rallying cry, when a community found its strength. I realized then that the real victory wasn't just keeping the garden or changing the rules. It was discovering the power we all have to shape the places we call home. As the seasons passed, the story of the garden became part of Willow Creek's history. New families moved in, drawn by the sense of community, the promise of a place where people looked out for each other. The board continued to evolve, learning from past mistakes, striving to balance order with empathy. The lessons we'd learned about courage, about resilience, about the importance of standing up for what's right, became the foundation for everything that followed. And as I watched my children grow, as I saw them take pride in their home, their neighborhood, their garden, I knew that the fight had been worth it. We faced down fear, challenged authority, and emerged stronger, more connected, more alive. The garden was more than just a patch of green. It was a testament to the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary change. In the end, the story wasn't just about a garden or an HOA or even a single neighborhood. It was about the choices we make, the risks we take, the courage we find when we refuse to be silenced. It was about the power of community, the strength of standing together, the hope that comes from knowing that even the smallest voice can make a difference. So if you ever find yourself facing an unfair rule, a petty authority, or a challenge that seems too big to overcome, remember this: change starts with one person, one act, one moment of courage. And sometimes, all it takes is a garden to remind us of what's possible. What would you fight for if you knew your voice could change everything?